Good morning, everyone. Thank you for allowing us to address this meeting of the Council. I'm Stephen Liddle, a member of Mayfield and East Houses Community Council. I've been asked by the Midlothian Federation of Community Councils to speak to you about their concerns relating to the new housing allocation decision, which forms part of the MLDP2 evidence report. In November last year, following widespread public consultation, the 15 community councils through the Federation wrote to the Head of Planning and all councillors expressing serious concerns regarding the further allocation of new housing sites in MLDP2. All but one community council are of the view that they don't want any more major new sites allocated or safeguarded for further housing development beyond those already included in the current adopted local plan. Our reasons for not wanting any major new allocations, as set out in the letter, are 1, the additional capital and revenue costs to the Council for schools, roads, public services and associated infrastructure, which will create serious financial problems for Midlothian Council. 2, more houses are not required because we have a housing surplus from MLDP1, which is more than enough to meet the Scottish Government target for MLDP2. 3, we need to build out the existing committed sites in MLDP1 before considering further growth, which may not actually turn out to be required. 4, developers will use the inclusion of new sites in MLDP2 to bring applications forward ahead of committed sites where they see a commercial advantage. Applications will be difficult to refuse when the land is zoned for housing, and therefore councillors will be under pressure to approve these or risk losing at appeal. 5, the surplus of new housing included in MLDP1 does not take account of the impact of densification on committed sites or delays in the existing build programme when forecasting the need for additional provision. In some cases, densification can be as much as 200% of the site capacities used in the local plan or housing land audit, thus further reducing the need for new sites. 6, the allocation of new sites in MLDP2 to satisfy possible MLDP3 needs would be absurd. Attempting to plan for the period 2036 to 2046 at this stage simply has too many variables and uncertainties to be able to predict the situation in the run-up to 2046. 7, local place plans should take priority in the preparation of MLDP2. Unless an LPP specifically seeks more new housing, then the presumption should be against any new allocations being included. 8, there may be a desire for smaller new sites of less than 20 units in specific community council wards in order to satisfy a local need for specific types of housing on gap sites or brownfield sites. If this is the case, then these needs will be identified in the relevant local place plan. 9, the view of the single community council with a variance of view was that while they share concern over the impact of additional housing on local infrastructure, they believe there is still a need for properly affordable housing, particularly for young people starting out on the housing ladder. They would also like to see a dialogue with planning officers on the types of housing that are included in MLDP2 and whether they are appropriate for their community. Following the recent decision by the Planning Committee to allocate a further 2,000 houses in MLDP2, Mayfield and East Houses Community Council have written to all councillors suggesting that the presentation of the housing numbers in the evidence report may have been misleading. The numbers give the impression that the existing allocations only marginally meet the target. Thus, this second letter is now supported by the community councils, and the Federation has asked me to discuss it with you today. Let me try to explain the issues in more detail using the table of numbers in the handout. All these numbers are from the evidence report, the 2023 Housing Land Audit and the 2023 Scottish Government's Vacant and Derelict Land Survey. As you can see from the table, The Scottish Government's target is 8850 houses to be built over the 10-year period 2026 to 2036. Based on the summarised information presented to you at the Planning Committee on the 4th of June, the anticipated supply from the completion of sites included in the current local plan was estimated by the Planning Department at 9124 houses. This gave the impression that there was little room for manoeuvre. You were then presented with three suggested options. In order to achieve a margin of safety over the target, you voted for the middle option, an increase of 2,000 houses over the target. However, it was not made clear to you that a number of categories of new housing had been omitted from these numbers. The first is expected windfall housing, where the total expected number included in the detailed evidence report is 830 houses. The second category is constrained sites, where the 2023 Housing Land Audit has identified 747 houses. The third category is the potential impact of densification of sites still to be granted planning consent. There are 2,120 units included in the 2023 Housing Land Audit which fit into this category. If this number increases through densification by even 10%, then a further 212 units would be produced. The fourth category is brownfield sites, vacant and derelict land, and reuse of empty buildings. There are currently 39 sites covering 76 hectares. That's 188 acres identified by the Council and included in the 2023 Scottish Government's Vacant and Derelict Land Survey. At a density ratio of 10 units per acre, these sites would have a maximum potential capacity of 1,880 units. We believe that the decision made by the Planning Department to completely exclude all these sources of new housing from the forecast summary is misleading. Even if you disregard the brownfield sites, the total is now at 10,900. When you add in the extra 2,000 houses which the Planning Committee voted for, the total becomes 12,900. This is a 4,000 surplus over the target, which equates to 45% more new houses than even the Scottish Government are asking for. We have no doubt, based on past experience, that when sites are being promoted by developers to contribute to the surplus, what you will get is 75% full market price housing and 25% social housing. All of these sites will be on greenfield land, and as you know, once that land has been allocated, you can't get it back. The loss of countryside and farmland is a permanent loss. While we recognise that not all of the 10,900 houses resulting from the current local plan may be viable, that is not a reason for excluding them all. It is well documented in the evidence report that the Planning Department has been put under pressure by the house building industry to exclude these categories of housing in order to create a false impression that we need further allocations in MLDP2. We put it to you that there is no pressure to make further housing allocations, that the financial consequences on the Council will be dire, and you still won't get the type of housing which local people need. There is a view held that in order to address the problem of council house waiting lists, the only solution available is to pursue more large-scale housing development in the hope that we can achieve 25% social housing by accepting 75% full market price housing. This is an extremely blunt instrument which would result in a huge financial cost to the Council in servicing the overall population increase. At its extreme, you would need to allocate land for 20,000 homes in order to provide 5,000 council houses, a potential population increase of 50,000 for Midlothian, which is absurd. To solve the problem requires a strategy focused 100% on social housing. We should ensure that MLDP2 fully supports the Council's strategic housing investment plan. This view is confirmed in the evidence report, section 1731, where the Planning Department has concisely summarised the strategy. Quote, "In setting the housing target, the Council will wish to set will wish to set a level which allows for a continuing social housing programme on a scale to meet the demand identified in the housing needs and demand assessment. But a targeted approach may be more efficient than raising the overall total significantly above the Scottish Government's target to meet social housing need."
Mr Liddell, that's your 10 minutes up, I'm afraid.
One paragraph to go.
Make it quick.
MLDP2 offers an opportunity to identify potential brownfield windfall sites that can help provide land for social housing. End of quote. The potential 10,900 houses which you have in front of you from the current local plan at 25% would yield 3,000 units of social housing. The balance, according to the Strategic Housing Investment Plan, could come from a variety of sources, including open market purchase by the Council or the Housing Infrastructure Fund, or building mid-market rental properties, or partnership working with registered social landlords. Specifying exactly the categories and quantities of housing that the Council wants to be built over the planned period would present a clear vision without unnecessary compromises being made. You can choose the number and the type of new houses that are required in each local area in conjunction with local place plans to meet the needs of local people. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Mr Liddell. I'll just ask you to turn your mic off. That's it. And over to questions from councillors, if you have any. Councillor Milligan.
Yeah, Provost. Sorry, I'm in a wee bit of a lost place here, but I mean, we've heard the presentation for the Federation of Community Councils, and there's some questions I have, but probably they're more for planning officers. I mean, I'm looking, for example, at the windfall sites and the claim that these will be an additionality. By their very nature, a windfall site is a windfall site. If you know what the site is going to be, then you should allocate it. And certainly, in my view, we've not been misled in that you always know there's going to be windfall sites in there. To suggest that planning officers have moved policy because they've been pressurised by developers, I've never known a planning officer to move a policy, no matter who pressurises them, including us. And for that matter. So I'm just wondering what the process is here. Do we have to wait till we come to the item on the agenda before allowing the planning officers to come in to respond to this and to allow elected members to have that debate, or do they come in at this stage?
I will check, as ever, with Mr Turpie. Mr Turpie, please.
Our policy on deputations is silent on that. It occurs, and again, I suppose I'll put the session out to the meeting, Provost, is that if the question is made to planning officers, that would then allow any supplementary questions back to the deputation, and it would seem more logical to do it that way so the matter can be addressed at this moment in time. My slight concern is that we have a maximum period of 10 minutes for questions and answers, and it's whether I don't want to take the questions away from the deputation, simply to allow almost the council officers to filibuster their way through there. I'm sure they won't be succinct, more succinct than I am anyway in answering the question. But that would be my suggestion to the meeting chair, is that we allow the questions to the officers, which then allows any supplementary back to the deputation to deal with at this point.
Councillor Cassidy.
Thank you, Provost. Yeah, just a question for Mr Turpie. Are we getting into dangerous waters here? Because this seems to me there could be predetermination interpretation if we continue with this line without forming our planning committee.
Provost, I suppose the first answer is no, because this is a policy strategy matter, and therefore the quasi-judicial rules won't apply to that. The danger might come if any member is too dogmatic in their position and make a stance that says that, if they said, and it's a former member of the council who always say, I'll never vote in favour of a wind farm. Then if you're that dogmatic, then you do run the risk of seeming to prejudge the issues. If, however, you say, I need to be convinced about the need for more housing sites, then but I will consider each application on its merits, then you would not be accused of prejudging.
Councillor Cassidy?
Yeah, Chair, Provost, I'm concerned that there will be eyes watching this and ears today, and I'd urge caution with my fellow councillors here, because we know where this can go, and the best advice in the world sometimes can be unpicked by smart brains.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Scott?
Thank you, Provost. On the constrained sites, I can only talk about some of the sites on Ingo Bridge because that's where I represent. We have got land that is possibly brownfield derelict, but they've got old gas holders underneath. The land is very contaminated. We've got mine gas and things like that. So, you know, using these constrained sites as part of your, numbers may be quite misleading as well, because actually it would take a great deal of money to actually clear these sites. And in fact, I don't know why the Coal Board hasn't done it, but there you go.
Thank you, Councillor Scott. Councillor Curran.
Thank you, Provost. There's some serious allegations made by the Deputy in both the written and verbal submission, and I think it's only fair, in the interest of fairness, that officers give an opportunity to respond to those allegations and assertions. Now, whether that's now or at 8:13 is either way to me, but I think it's only fair that we give officers that opportunity.
Mr Anderson or Mr Oliver, Mr Arnstoff, Mr Oliver. Thank you. Mr Oliver.
Thank you, Provost. We'll try to respond within the timescales as the monitoring officer has said. Mr Andorf's is going to respond to each of the points that has been laid out. I would just like to say from the outset that we have enjoyed good relationships and engagements with the community councils and the Federation and a number of bodies through this process of the local development plan, and that's evidenced within the evidence report engagement tracker. The use of the term misleading is disappointing, I have to say, at this outset, and completely unjustified. But I'll ask Mr Andorf now to respond to your point.
Mr Arnstoff.
Thank you, Provost. If I could just start by working through the numbers, Provost, insofar as the accusation that the elected members have been misled. The required housing numbers were set out initially to elected members in October 2023 as part of the local land audit. Then they were set out again in November to Planning Committee, then again in June of this year to Planning Committee. Those figures are correct. They are the correct figures to consider. They are at odds with those figures that have been presented to today, and I shall just quickly explain the variation and why I believe those figures are not correct. The starting point, though, however, Chair, is that we are talking about a local housing land requirement, effectively a housing target that has been set in MPF 4, and elected members will be familiar with the target, which is 8,850 over a 10-year period from the point of adoption, i.e. not today in 2026. Now, to deliver that housing target, the Council is required to identify sites that meet that target. And that's quite critical because it means two things. First of all, you don't include windfall sites which have been added into the site because they're not known. If they are known, as Councillor Milligan said, you should be allocating them. So you don't add the additional figure in. The second point is related to constraint sites. MPF 4 makes it clear that those sites in the plan need to be deliverable, i.e. not constrained, or if there's a constraint, there's a known solution to the constraint, so hence you do not include the figures. The third point is related to identification. This is that concept that a site's allocated for a set number, but when the plan and application comes in, it's higher than its allocation. Now, in terms of the core figures, they're based on the current housing supply, which is set out in the housing audit. Those figures already include additional units which have come forward or been identified by house builders. So there's a danger of effectively double counting those numbers. The next inequity or presumption is that the representation suggests elected members at Planning Committee agreed to 2,000 additional units above what the supply is. That is not correct. Elected members spoke about an exact figure. It wasn't a 2,000 on top of wherever you land with your supply. So that presumption that gets you up to 12,800 plus is incorrect. So as a consequence, the 45% reference is again incorrect. If you take the upper limit of the figure decided by elected members, which was up to 11,000, that would be an increase of 24% above the MAFLA figure. In terms of the number of points, I won't necessarily read out all the points, but I will reference to them by number. The first one in relation to additional burden as a consequence of development. Elected members will be familiar with that, and they will also be familiar with the concept of developer contributions, which is designed to take a contribution to mitigate the infrastructure impact from that development. The second point relates to housing numbers and surpluses. There is an issue here in relation to when you're setting housing numbers, you're permanently overlapping plans, so the numbers are fluid, and of course house building continues to be built, so you never get the exact numbers at an exact point. But yes, there are sites that haven't been built out from the last local plan. Elected members will be familiar with those. You've got a collection of units almost up to 4,000 at Shawfair. You've got approximately 1,000 at Hopefield Farm 2. You've got almost 1,000 at Redhugh, and so on and so forth. So those units haven't been built out yet, but they are locked in to the plan. In terms of points 3 and 4, I should take those together, and this is in relation to allocating new sites and how you consider them in relation to existing sites in the plan. It is true that once sites become allocated in a plan, in terms of the timing of build, applications, etc., it is within the hands of the applicant and the developer. So sites newly allocated can sometimes be brought forward in advance of existing sites. But that is normal, that's acceptable. There is no way in which you can cherry pick which ones are built first, second, third, etc. The fifth point relates to densification, and we touched on that earlier in terms of how we're picking it up through the housing land audit. The next point, number 6, relates to MPF 4 and this issue about whether you plan for the longer term. Town planning is about planning for the long term, and MPF 4 not only talks about setting a housing target for the next local plan, which we're aiming to be 2026 to 36, but also to have a view on the future. That's good placemaking. The local place plans is point 7. Elected members had a report on the local place plans to committee in June, and the conclusion of that was that the local place plans that have been submitted, validated and registered will be considered as part of that local plan process. It's important to remember at the moment we're in the first stage, i.e. the evidence base. You've effectively gathered all the evidence from a range of sources, and you're going to submit that for evidence gate check. But it's the next phase where we get into site allocation and policy drafting. And the final point is about smaller sites or smaller allocations. There is scope to allocate sites, smaller sites. That would be, again, consideration in the next stage of the process. My final point, Chair, is in relation to the comments that the planning authority or planning officers are working closely with Homes for Scotland. There is a requirement in MPF 4 and the regulations that the Council negotiate and engage with the relevant parties, whether they're key agencies or communities. The Council has been doing that. If you want to understand housing, you need to speak to the house builders, whether that's the market house builders or the affordable house builders. So that is normal practice and standard. It is worth noting, though, that there are some disagreements between the Planning Authority and Homes for Scotland. That's the umbrella group that represents the house building industry. So the fact that we're at odds with them on a number of key points, one is in terms of housing numbers, and two in regard to site methodology, which is how you pick and choose which sites, just goes to show that we have been robust in that communication, and that is set out in the evidence report. Thank you, Provost.
Thank you, Mr Arnsdorf. Our 10 minutes for question is up. Having heard from Mr Arnsdorf and Mr Oliver, do any elected members wish to further question our deputation? Councillor Milligan.
Yeah, Provost, just to ask the presenters of the deputation if the explanation being given by the planning manager and the head of planning gives them a better understanding or did they dispute any of the figures?
Mr Liddell.
I think what this boils down to at the end of the day is presentation. I don't think the planning officers would disagree with the individual numbers that I've put together, although they are disagreeing with totalling them up. I made it clear in the presentation that the total was not an expected total because there would be sites that could not be produced over the next 10 years. However, I would suggest that we need to look at the overall picture and include the 3 or 4 categories because, based on previous experience, and this is highlighted in the detail of the evidence report, we do get windfall housing. It's unpredictable, but we have a track record of how much of it gets produced. We do have a track record of being able to overturn constraints and constrained sites, and we do have a track record of being able to produce development on brownfield sites. So to exclude these from the summary, in my opinion, is not helpful. All the numbers are in the report. None of the numbers are made up. It's simply a case of taking an evaluation of each of these categories to see how much council housing can be produced from them. And there's a pool there that I've indicated as a maximum of 10,900. I think it would be helpful to look at that in more detail and see realistically what can be produced as opposed to not including it in the numbers at all. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Liddell. So we will move on